In the summer of 1996, Idaho Falls, a peaceful city along the Snake River, was a community untouched by violent crime. Residents felt safe in their homes and on the streets, secure in the belief that such horrors only happened elsewhere. Angie Dodge, an 18-year-old who had recently moved into her first apartment, was part of that community. Vibrant, ambitious, and full of promise, Angie had dreams of becoming a graphic designer. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, cherished by her mother, Carol Dodge, who described her as compassionate and fearless. On the morning of June 13, 1996, Angie didn't answer her mother's calls, a worrying sign in itself. By mid-morning, her co-workers from a local factory where she worked part-time arrived at her apartment after she didn't show up for work. What they discovered was a scene of unspeakable horror. Angie had been brutally attacked. She had been raped and stabbed multiple times, her lifeless body left on the floor of her bedroom. The crime was savage, with evidence suggesting a frenzy and violent struggle. Blood spattered the walls and floor, and Angie's neck showed deep slash wounds that caused her death. The small-town police force, unaccustomed to handling such a heinous crime, was thrust into the most significant investigation it had ever faced. Part 2, a community in shock in the hunt for answers. The news of Angie's murder spread quickly through Idaho Falls. Friends, neighbors, and strangers alike mourned the loss of the bright young woman whose life had been cut short. Candlelight vigils were held, and local residents flooded the police station with tips. Despite the outpouring of grief and support, fear gripped the town. If something so horrific could happen to Angie, could it happen to anyone? From the outset, investigators faced immense pressure to solve the case. The crime scene provided some critical evidence, including semen left by the attacker, which was collected for DNA analysis. However, in 1996, DNA technology was still in its infancy, and the local lab could not identify a suspect based on the sample. With no immediate leads, police began interviewing Angie's friends and acquaintances, searching for anyone who might have had a motive to harm her. The investigation soon focused on a group of young men who were friends with Angie. Among them was Chris Tapp, a 20-year-old known to hang out with her social circle. Though Tapp initially had no direct ties to the crime, he became a person of interest after a series of interviews with police. Part 3, the interrogation of Chris Tapp. Over the course of several months, Tapp was interrogated multiple times. At first, he denied any involvement in Angie's murder. However, as the questioning intensified, police began using psychological tactics, including the threat of severe consequences if he didn't cooperate. They also offered him the possibility of leniency if he provided information about others who might have been involved. The interrogation sessions were long and grueling, often stretching late into the night. Tapp, who had no legal representation present, was told repeatedly that the police had evidence linking him to the crime, though this was untrue. Under the weight of these tactics, Tapp's resolve crumbled. Eventually, he confessed to being present during Angie's murder, implicating himself and 2 other men. Yet, even within his confession, there were glaring inconsistencies. Tapp's account didn't match the physical evidence at the crime scene, and his descriptions of the attack lacked critical details. Despite these discrepancies, prosecutors relied heavily on Tapp's confession to build their case. In 1998, he was charged with rape and first-degree murder. Part 4, the trial and conviction of Chris Tapp. The trial of Chris Tapp captivated Idaho Falls. Prosecutors painted him as a troubled young man who had participated in the heinous crime against Angie. His videotaped confession became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, even though it was riddled with inaccuracies. Defense attorneys argued that the confession had been coerced and that Tapp's DNA did not match the semen found at the crime scene. However, these arguments were overshadowed by the emotional weight of Angie's murder and the desire for justice. After a brief deliberation, the jury found Tapp guilty of rape and murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many in Idaho Falls, the conviction brought a sense of closure. The killer had been caught, and the community could begin to heal, or so it seemed. Part 5, A Mother's Doubts. Carol Dodge, Angie's mother, initially believed that justice had been served. She had watched as Chris Tapp was convicted and sentenced, trusting in the legal system to deliver the truth. But over the years, Carol began to question the narrative she had been told. As she reviewed the details of the case, the discrepancies in Tapp's confession and the lack of physical evidence gnawed at her. If Tapp was guilty, why didn't his DNA match the sample found at the scene? And if he wasn't guilty, then who was? Driven by these questions, Carol embarked on her own investigation. She reached out to legal experts, forensic scientists, and advocacy groups specializing in wrongful convictions. She pored over court documents, police reports, and interrogation transcripts, determined to uncover the truth about what had happened to her daughter. Part 6, Advancements in DNA Technology. By the early 2010s, DNA technology had advanced significantly. Cold case investigators across the country were using genetic evidence to solve crimes that had long been considered unsolvable. Carol Dodge began pushing for Angie's case to be revisited using these new techniques. In 2017, her efforts paid off when authorities agreed to retest the DNA evidence collected from Angie's apartment. The results were groundbreaking. Using a method known as genetic genealogy, investigators traced the DNA sample to a family line, eventually narrowing it down to a single suspect, Brian Drips. Drips, who had lived near Angie at the time of her murder, had never been a suspect during the initial investigation. Now, more than 2 decades later, he was about to face justice. Part 7, The Confession of Brian Drips. In 2019, police tracked down Brian Drips, who was living in Caldwell, Idaho. When confronted with the DNA evidence, Drips confessed to the crime. He admitted to raping and killing Angie but claimed that he had acted alone. His confession exonerated Chris Tapp, who had spent 20 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. For Carol Dodge, the revelation was both devastating and vindicating. She had fought tirelessly to prove Tapp's innocence and find her daughter's true killer. Now, at last, the truth was out. Part 8, Justice and Legacy. In 2021, Brian Drips pleaded guilty to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge. He was sentenced to life in prison, bringing a measure of closure to a case that had haunted Idaho Falls for 25 years. Chris Tapp, meanwhile, was fully exonerated and became an advocate for others wrongfully convicted. Angie's case highlighted the dangers of false confessions and the critical role of DNA technology in modern investigations. It also underscored the power of a mother's love and determination in the face of unimaginable tragedy. Carol Dodge's unwavering pursuit of justice ensured that Angie's voice was not silenced and that her story would continue to inspire change.